Hi, it's Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead. Happy to be back with you again today. We're continuing to read in our new book, Little House in the Prairie by Laura Ingalls Wilder. We're on chapter 2. Yesterday, they left their little house in the big woods, and now they've came to a big creek, and I think it's been flooding there, so they've had to be parked because the water was just too high for them to cross safely. And Pa had to dig mud away from the wheels so that they could go. So we're going to read on this story. Crossing the Creek. Pet and Patty began to trot briskly as they were glad to. Laura held tight to the wagon bow and stood up in the jolting wagon. Beyond Pa's shoulder and far across the waves of green grass, she could see the trees. And they were not like any trees she had seen before. They were no taller than bushes. "Whoa," Pa said suddenly. "Now which way?" he muttered to himself. The road divided there, and you could not tell which was the more traveled way. Both of them were faint wheel tracks in the grass. One went toward the west, the other sloped down a little towards the south, but soon vanished in the tall, blowing grasses. "Better go downhill, I guess," Pa decided. "The creek's down in the bottoms. Must be this way to the ford." He turned Pet and Patty toward the south. The road went down and up and down and up again, over gently curving land. The trees were nearer now, but they were no taller. Then Laura gasped and clutched the wagon bow, for almost under Pet and Patty's noses there was no more blowing grass. There was no land at all. She looked beyond the edge of the land and across the tops of the trees. The road turned there. For a little way it went along the cliff's top. Then it went sharply downward. Pa pulled on the brakes. Pet and Patty braced themselves backwards and almost sat down. The wagon wheels slid onward, little by little, lowering the wagon further down the steep slope into the ground. Jagged cliffs of bare red earth rose up on both sides of the wagon. Grass waved along their tops, but nothing grew on their seamed straight up and down sides. They were hot, and the heat came from them across Laura's face. The wind was still blowing overhead, but it did not blow down into this deep crack in the ground. The stillness there seemed strange and empty. Then, once more, the wagon leveled. The narrow crack down which had opened up to the bottomlands. Here grew tall trees whose tops Laura had seen from the prairie above. Shady groves were scattered on the rolling meadows, and in the groves deer were laying down, hardly to be seen among the shadows. The deer turned their heads toward the wagon, and curious fawns stood up to see it more clearly. Laura was surprised because she did not see the creek. But the bottomlands were wide. Down here, below the prairie, there were gentle hills and open, sunny places. The air was still and hot. Under the wagon wheels, the ground was soft. In the sunny, open spaces, the grass grew thin, and deer had cropped it short. For a while, the high, bare cliffs of red earth stood up behind the wagon, but they were almost hidden behind the hills and trees when Pa and Patty stopped to get a drink from the creek. The rushing sound of the water filled the still air. All along the creek banks, the trees hung over it and made it dark with shadows. In the middle, it ran swiftly, sparkling silver and blue. "This creek's pretty high," Pa said, "but I guess we can make it all right. You can see this is a ford by the old wagon wheel ruts. What do you say, Carolyn? Whatever you say, Charles, Ma answered. Pat and Patty lifted their wet noses. They perked their ears forward, looking at the creek. Then they pricked them backward to hear what Pa would say. They sighed and laid their soft noses together to whisper to each other. A little way upstream, Jack was lapping the water with his red tongue. I'll tie down the wagon cover, Pa said. He climbed down from the seat, unrolled the canvas sides, and tied them firmly to the wagon box. Then he pulled the rope out the back so that the canvas puckered together in the middle, leaving only a tiny round hole, too small to see through. Mary huddled down on the bed. She did not like fords. She was afraid of the rushing water. That's where they would cross the river, see? But Laura was excited, and she liked the splashing. Pa climbed to the seat, saying, "They may have to swim out there in the middle, but we'll make it all right, Carolyn." Laura thought of Jack and said, "I wish Jack could ride in the wagon, Pa." Pa did not answer. He gathered the reins tightly in his hands. Ma said, "Jack can swim, Laura. He'll be all right." The wagon went forward softly in the mud. Water began to splash against the wheels. The splashing grew louder. The wagon shook as the noisy water struck at it. Then all at once, the wagon lifted and balanced and swayed. It was a lovely feeling. The noise stopped, and Ma said sharply, "Lie down, girls." Quick as a flash, Laura and Mary dropped flat on the bed. When Ma spoke like that, they did what they were told. Ma's arm pulled a smoldering blanket over their heads and all. "Be still, just as you are. Don't move," she said. Mary did not move. She was trembling and still. But Laura could not help wiggling a little bit. She did so want to see what was happening. She could feel the wagon swaying and turning. Splashing was noisy again. Then it died away. Then Pa's voice frightened Laura. He said, "Take 'em, Carolyn." The wagon lurched, and there was a sudden heavy splash beside it. Laura sat straight up and clawed the blanket over her head. Pa was gone. Ma sat alone, holding tight to the reins with both hands. Mary hid her face in the blanket again, but Laura rose up farther. She couldn't see the creek bank. She couldn't see anything in front of the wagon but water rushing at it. And in the water, 3 heads. Pet's head and Patty's head and Pa's small wet head. Pa's fist in the water was holding tight to Pet's bridle. Laura could faintly hear Pa's voice through the rushing water. It sounded calm and cheerful, but she couldn't hear what he was saying. He was talking to the horses. And I feel like I did not show you that first picture. So let me switch back and make sure that you got to see this picture. That's what it looked like when they were crossing. "Lie down, Laura," Ma said. Laura lay down. She felt cold and sick. Her eyes were shut tight, but she could still see that terrible water and hear Pa's brown beard drowning in it. For a long, long time, the wagon swayed and swung, and Mary cried without making a sound, and Laura's stomach felt sicker and sicker. Then the front wheels struck and grated, and Pa shouted. The whole wagon jerked and jolted and tipped backwards, but the wheels were turning on the ground. Laura was up again, holding to the seat. She saw Pet and Patty scrambling wetbacks, climbing a steep bank, and Pa running beside them, shouting, "Hi, Patty! Hi, Pet! Get up! Get up! Whoopsie daisy! Good girls!" At the top of the bank, they stood, panting and holding very still, soaking wet. This is what type of problem they'd had. Now it's a big problem, huh? And the wagon stood still, safely out of that creek. Pa stood panting and dripping. Ma said, "Oh, Charles." There, Carolyn," said Pa. "We're safe. We're all safe thanks to a good tight wagon box, well fastened to the running gear. I never saw a creek rise so fast in my life. Pet and Patty are good swimmers, but I guess they wouldn't have made it if I hadn't helped them. If Pa hadn't known what to do, or if Ma had been too frightened to drive, or if Laura and Mary had been naughty and bothered her, then they would have all been lost. The river would have rolled them over and over and carried them away and drowned them, and nobody would have ever known what happened to them. For weeks, perhaps, no other person would come along this road." "Well," Pa said, "all's well that ends well." And Ma said, "Charles, you're wet to the skin." Before Pa could answer, Laura cried, "Oh, where's Jack?" They had forgotten Jack. They had left him on the other side of the dreadful water, and now they could not see him anywhere. He must have tried to swim after them, but they could not see him struggling in the water now. Laura swallowed hard and kept from crying. She knew it was shameful to cry, but there was crying inside of her. All the long way from Wisconsin, poor Jack had followed them so patiently and faithfully, and now they had left him to drown. He was so tired, and they might have taken him into the wagon. He had stood on the bank and seen the wagon going away from him, as if they didn't care for him at all. And he would never know how much they wanted him. Pa said he wouldn't have done such a thing to Jack, not for $1,000,000, if he'd known how that creek would rise when they were in midstream. He would have never let Jack try to swim it. "But that can't be helped now," he said. He went far up and down the creek bank, calling for Jack, calling and whistling for him. It was no use. Jack was gone. At last there was nothing to do but go on. Pet and Patty were rested. Pa's clothes had dried on him while he searched for Jack. He took the reins again and drove uphill out of the river bottoms. Laura looked back all the way. She knew she wouldn't see Jack again. And here she was. Oh, that's very sad. But she wanted to see him again. She didn't see anything but low curves of land coming between the wagon and the creek. And beyond the creek, those strange cliffs of red earth rose up again. Then other bluffs, just like them, stood up in the front of the wagon. Faint wheel tracks went into the crack between those earthen walls. Pet and Patty climbed until the crack became a small grassy valley, and the valley widened out over on the high prairie once more. No roads, not even the faintest trace of wheels or a rider passing could be seen anywhere. The prairie looked as if no human eye had ever seen it before. Only the tall, wild grass covered the empty, endless land, and a great, empty sky arched over it. Far away, the sun's edge touched the rim of the earth. The sun was enormous and was throbbing and pulsing in the light. All around the sky's edge ran a pale pink glow, and above the pink was yellow, and above that was blue. Above the blue sky was no color at all. Purple shadows were gathering all over the land, and the wind was mourning. Pa stopped the mustangs. He and Ma got out of the wagon to make camp, and Mary and Laura climbed down to the ground too. "Oh, Ma," Laura begged, "Jack has gone to heaven, hasn't he? It was such a good job. Can't he go to heaven?" Ma did not know what to answer, but Pa said, "Yes, Laura, he can. God that doesn't forget the sparrows won't let a good dog like Jack left out in the cold." Laura felt only a little bit better. She was not happy. Pa did not whistle about his work as usual, and after a while he said, "And what will we do in the wild country without a good watchdog? I don't know." Well, that was pretty sad. Dangerous. I must have had what we call a flash flood. Those come up all at once. Well, it's Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead. I want to pray blessings on you and yours, in your house and out of your house, in the day and the night. Whatever you do, keep dreaming.